Sometimes game developers do some really interesting things to make a video game truly work and convince you, the player, that something on screen is actually happening. So today we're talking about 10 things video games use to trick your brain. We've done a video like this in the past. I definitely recommend checking that out, but we found way more tools and trickery that developers use to make the video games that we love happen, and it all feels like magic, and we're fascinated. Also, I want to point out that we're not experts. We're going to try to explain this stuff the best we can because it's fascinating. So let's get started off with number 10 and talk about Mario, of all people. This one's actually a bit more civilian, it's a bit more standard, and you may have actually realized it when you're playing, but it's still worth discussing. We wanted to reference a specific interview from Gama Sutra, an interview with Koichi Hayashida, who was the director of Super Mario 3D Land and Super Mario Galaxy 2. He talks about a technique that from the beginning was utilized by Shigeru Miyamoto, and it's basically using level design to introduce players to gameplay concepts. The gameplay concepts, like a game mechanic or specific ability, will influence the actual design of that level to teach you how to use it properly in different situations and not just give you a regular boring on-screen tutorial. And I quote, "First, you have to learn how to use that gameplay mechanic, and then the stage will offer you a slightly more complicated scenario in which you have to use it. And then the next step is something crazy happens that makes you think about it in a new way you weren't expecting. And then you get to demonstrate, finally, what sort of mastery you've gained over it." Now, I know this isn't the biggest trick. I know many of us have realized that this has happened to us while we're playing. Like, okay, I got the thing, that's how I use the thing, clearly I need to use that thing to open the door to get out and continue my adventure. But it's interesting to talk about, especially because he compared it to a narrative structure in Japanese manga. It's a phrase called kiso tenketsu. Hayashida said specifically that it was Shigeru Miyamoto who brought this manga concept over to video game development, and that's pretty cool. Now, next up at number 9, you are going to notice that throughout this video, we're going to be referencing random Twitter threads that have gone down throughout the years where people shared their stories in game development of how they used mechanics to trick players. Here's a great example. In a response to a thread by @GaoMe in 2017, Charlie Cleveland, a director and designer for Subnautica, said, "In Subnautica, we fade to black as you run out of oxygen, but then give you a few more phantom seconds for lots of just barely moments." This is a great example of something that a lot of game developers do, and I think we've talked about this in the past, where essentially you actually have a little bit more health than the game actually indicates or tells you. Just a little extra sliver when you get past 0 to make it really feel like you just barely survived, like you got through by the skin of your teeth. And I gotta say, it's definitely a cruel trick. It's almost basically a lie. Maybe the bottom of your health bar, your last 1 or 2% of your life bar is actually a lie, but hey, it does make the game pretty fun, and I definitely know for sure that Subnautica is not the only game that has done this. Now, next at number 8, let's talk about level design and a cool trick that IO Interactive does with Hitman. The modern reboots of Hitman, the new Hitman and then Hitman 2, have felt like they were just absolutely massive, from the possibilities you could do in the levels to the actual size and scale of the levels themselves. In an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, IO Interactive's Torbjorn Christensen explained that they got their levels, specifically like Sapienza and Hokkaido, to feel so expansive and just ongoing by designing the game as what he called, and I quote, snail houses, or just giant spirals. The idea behind that, in short, is basically always giving the player a new direction to go and a new interesting thing to focus on, always having focal points, a new place to walk, a new place to turn, not a lot of dead ends. He said, and I quote, "One of the reasons why all these levels feel larger than maybe they are in terms of square meters is that you can keep moving ahead all of the time. There are no dead ends and you never have to backtrack, although you can if you want." Basically, it's all about flow and keeping the player moving. So if you actually stop and look at the world, maybe there's a bit too many doors or an overwhelming amount of staircases or just things going on. It's so you can kind of keep moving as the player and feel like you're walking through a giant map. It's really interesting, and honestly, we're going to link as many of the interviews as we can down in the description below because it's worth reading up on. Now, next at number 7, another reply to that thread we mentioned earlier is from game developer Steve Thornton. He is a level designer, and he admitted on Twitter, and I quote, "In some LEGO games, ranged enemies have hit-miss probability, and on a miss, the projectiles are offset but also have no collision just in case. This allows enemies to shoot really often to create a manic feeling of being under fire and to ensure players also don't walk into an offset miss." Another developer, Raicha7, followed up and said, we use this a lot in the blaster battles of LEGO Force Awakens. We also spawned lots of fake bolts off screen as well to add to the chaos. Basically, what they're trying to do in the LEGO games here is create the tension and the chaos of a shootout without the player actually being at risk of being hit by a million different bullets flying around. The idea was to have an enemy shoot a lot and make it chaotic, but because they have the hit or miss probability, they made sure that those laser beams, if there are more players on screen at once, couldn't actually be hit by a miss, if that makes sense. So while it looks chaotic and crazy and dangerous, it's not as impossible or as difficult as you think. Pretty fun food for thought, and honestly, I'm really curious to see how many other games do stuff like this. Now next, down to number 6, we have to talk about Petey, because thankfully a couple of years ago, the famous Lance McDonald hacked the game and revealed that Hideo Kojima's weird playable teaser horror game actually had a ghost that was just always right off screen, ready to scare you. Basically, it looks like Kojima and his team did a very literal trick to make it feel like you're always being followed, always being haunted by a ghost that you only really see in specific instances, but you kind of always get that feeling that they're there. Sometimes you catch a shadow, sometimes the light just plays tricks on you as you endlessly walk through these hallways, and sometimes she gets you. But really, after hacking the camera, Lance McDonald revealed that the ghost Lisa is actually tethered behind you at all times, which is absolutely horrifying, dude. It's kind of cool though, and I really like it because there's of course so many other tricks developers could have used to scare you, the player, but the fact that they decided to actually, in the technicality of it, have the ghost behind you at all times is actually really sweet, and just makes PT even more fascinating than it already is. I feel like this is the weird little game demo that is just a gift that keeps on giving to gamers the more we find out about it, and we're always going to be talking about it because it kicked ass. Now at number 5, Mario 64's endless stairs trick. You probably remember in this game running up those stairs that seem like they're never ending. And basically, that stair thing is a trick. A lot of games, especially back then, couldn't actually fit a giant endless staircase on the game's cart, so of course, they used some trickery. What the developers used is a relative teleport, essentially. The game will teleport you backwards when you reach a certain step threshold, and then you're very seamlessly pushed down a couple of steps without actually realizing because you're in the middle of running, and it makes it feel endless. Did I explain that okay? This is something that has been debated online. It's hard to find like official confirmation on it, but from what we've seen, it does seem like it's a pretty cool and believable thing. Still, I think it's really impressive to point out that even for such an old game, when you're doing it and it is teleporting you, you do not realize at all. That is super clean and impressive if you ask me. Now next at number 4, here's a really funny one. This is a response to a Twitter thread similar to the one we talked about previously, started by @the_Rami in 2018. Senior games designer James Henley described a very interesting predicament from Mass Effect 1. He said, and I quote, "I was building a fight with small turrets, but we didn't actually have any. Instead, I built a couple of small boxes, shoving flying drones into them, and deleted all movement nodes from their playpen. Consequently, they never tried to move and they just sat there shooting." He then said later on in a thread that this was in Fist's office in the back of Cora's den on the Citadel. And basically, a simple version of what he's explaining is that the game didn't have any type of turrets, so he took an asset or a thing already designed in the game and conformed it and messed with it to make it a turret. So yes, if you encountered those turrets in that office on the Citadel, what you were fighting against, what was actually shooting at you, wasn't really technically a turret, but you didn't know at the time, did you? It definitely convinced you, right? That's exactly what we're talking about here. Video game development tricks that can completely convince your brain. Now down to number 3, here's an interesting one from Warframe. Warframe is honestly a game that just keeps on going and gets better and better, and now has a massive community that is downright in love with it. And one of the biggest changes to Warframe, especially if you just played it at launch many years ago, is that there are actually ships in the game, and ship-to-ship space combat. Now space games, especially ones like No Man's Sky or Elite Dangerous or EVE Online, they're incredibly complex under the hood and behind the scenes. It requires a lot of math, a lot of game design work, and well, basically Digital Extremes found a quick and dirty workaround, and it totally makes sense. Apparently Digital Extremes had some issue with the fact that it's really ambitious. You can fly around your ship, you can walk around your ship, you can get out of your ship, you can board other ships, all while floating through space, and that's a lot for a game that wasn't actually designed to be like that in the first place. But the biggest trick here, the thing they did to really convince you the player, is that the ship itself isn't actually moving. Shout out to PC Gamer for breaking this down in a simplistic way, but basically, the developers are using an old school video game technique called portal rendering, which kind of works like the puzzles in Portal. So basically, the game presents a giant portal that is going to somewhere else, and to quote PC Gamer, when you look through it, you see it from a different perspective. So the cockpit of Warframe's ships is actually like a big portal into a completely different map. And to quote designer Steve Sinclair, the trick of our space battles is an ancient rendering technique twisted. You see your ship interior, but windows are a portal attached to the Railjack entity itself in the combat zone, which itself looks into the art space skybox. So essentially what this is kind of a simple solution to a complex problem, but still it's kind of hard and weird to explain, to the point where the PC Gamer interview says that some digital extreme programmers were actually confused by it. Still, I think it's a great example of the fact that video games, from their inception, the development of them is basically a miracle. A lot of it is magic, and that magic is essentially smart people coming up with cool tricks. And since we are talking about tricks, since we're coming down to number 2, let's talk about a negative one for a second. Certain free-to-play games, particularly on mobile and web, are designed to create discomfort, and then essentially the player seeks out a solution to that discomfort, but oftentimes that discomfort is some sort of monetization or paying for something or some sort of solution like that. Lots of free-to-play games have been built like this, and they take advantage of this. There are developers going on record. There are articles written about how these things work, even down to something like an endless clicker game. They are designed to be like mindless diversions, but if you want some sort of instant satisfaction, or if you want to make it a little bit more convenient for you, you could throw a little bit of money at that game to have usually a temporary solution. Lots of developers of specific games know that a lot of players don't want to spend a single penny, so they slowly break down your resolve over time. But the bottom line to be argued is that trick that a lot of people call it, where a game essentially is built to present a challenge to you and then give you a way to overcome that challenge, and sometimes that challenge is you spending money. It's unfortunate. Thankfully, most people are wise to it by now. We've talked about this type of stuff on the channel before. Still, a lot of mobile games are very guilty of it, so just be aware next time, all right? Now down to number 1, we want to talk about a trick that is downright spooky. You hear rumors about it, it floats around out there. We've tried to find what we can on it. It seems like it's definitely likely, but apparently the mannequins in Skyrim are actually NPC models that have their AI disabled. Yes, the actual mannequins that can sit in your houses in the game where you put your armor on and stuff, they are actually a specific NPC model that is just like a humanoid mannequin. So they can essentially operate and work like any AI in the game. They have the capability, it's just switched to off. Now, of course, there are many times where people have examples of loading into a game and loading into their house only to see something is a little off, like maybe the mannequin is slightly moved to the side or just in a slightly different position, or sometimes in weirder cases, people have seen mannequins moving around or stopping and suddenly looking at them. A lot of people like to joke that it's essentially like as the game is loading, all the mannequins are running and standing in place and getting ready for then you, the player, to enter, and then they stand completely still, almost like something out of Toy Story, but it's really messed up. The fact that they're essentially frozen NPCs is downright haunting and really kind of backs up the theory that a lot of people have had in many video games where it feels like the mannequins are watching you. Still, it's what they did, probably a quick and dirty trick to get a nice, easy, interactable mannequin. And things like that and tricks like that happen in game development every day, and we like pointing them out, at least for the layman, as much as we can. We want to hear from you guys down in the comments what sort of developer tricks you know of, and what you enjoy, or maybe something you've uncovered, or maybe you've broken a game. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. But if you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something, clicking the like button is the best way you can help us out. We'd really appreciate that. And if you're new, consider subscribing, maybe hitting that notification bell, because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.